Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one we have significant developments as the Ukrainian front line is showing signs of a complete collapse on several sections of it. Starting out in the Vuhledar direction, the Russians stormed the coal mine number 3 where they managed to capture it with an armored assault. The way it happened is that the Russians were launching two armored assaults in two separate groups. The first one went through the northern part, entered it by shooting at the outskirts of it, the first buildings of the coal mine, and dropping off their infantry towards the entrance of it. A second one pushed from the southern flank and reached the central parts of it. This allowed the Russians to create a strong presence within the coal mine, and they from that moved on to capture the rest of it. So with this, the Russians have managed to actually gain control over a secondary road connecting between Vuhledar and Vuhledar. Now the Russians are lacking just control over one road that diverges from this hill area here to the southwest of the coal mine. This means it is likely that the Russians will continue pushing through the main road from the third coal mine towards the next fortified position of the Ukrainians, and then down south from there to cut off the final connection here on the eastern parts of Vuhledar. There's one final road remaining, which is this one going from the south of Vuhledar down south along the fortified positions and all the way down south to the west of Vuhledar, where there's likely a connection between the western parts here towards Vuhledar the Ukrainians have created. This means that the current situation is that the Russians are trying to cut off the Ukrainian supplies by pushing in a western direction, and this is a significant development in relation to that push to completely cut off all supply lines to Vuhledar. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Ukrainsk, the Russians have advanced both to the north, east and south of the town. In the northern parts, they are flanking the town itself by advancing along the fortified positions, gaining control over some of the western parts, and hitting the road connecting Ukrainsk up to Selidove. This limits the supply to only a connection that goes through from Sukorine all the way through to the northern parts, intersecting here and then into Ukrainsk. The Russians have captured the majority of the town by capturing the entirety of the southern parts of it, and are fighting over the railway station in the central parts of it, and then the coal mine just next to it. This means that heavy fighting is taking place within the semi-encirclement of Ukrainsk, and the Russians control the majority of it, as well as every single supply line except for a single one where they have fire control over it. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Chasiv Yar, there are two significant developments. In the southern flank near Ivanivske, the Russians have here managed to push towards the canal and create a crossing along the forest areas where the Russians have gained a foothold on the western bank of the canal in the southern flank of Chasiv Yar. This is a connection to the Russian control over the eastern bank of the canal west of Klishivka, capturing all of the fortified positions in the central parts, and there's no fortified positions in the northern part that remained under Ukrainian control. The Russians took advantage of that to launch an assault that allowed them to gain a foothold across. This means that the Russians will now act to develop their positions here from Ivanivske in the north along the southern flank of Chasiv Yar around the forest area, and all the way down south to the second crossing, where the Russians will likely initiate a pincer maneuver to flank the Ukrainian fortified positions in the area. Therefore, we'll likely see heavy fighting in the southern flank of Chasiv Yar in the coming period of time. And the northern parts, the Russians, with their connection and crossing over the western bank of the canal near Kalinina, are also pushing in the northern direction towards Kryhorivka, where they've managed to gain control over some of the fortified positions along the canal and the fortified positions south of Kryhorivka located in the heights. Therefore, we will likely see Kryhorivka under full Russian control within the next few days. Moving further north, we see here in the direction of the Kursk offensive, the Russians have started a new push where they've managed to gain a foothold within Darino across the Shahist River. This means that the Russians are here attempting to cross the river, have successfully done so, and have gained a foothold within Darino If they gain full control over Darino, they'll have a foothold across the river and they'll be able to flank the Ukrainian positions along this river line. At the same time, they've made a push to the north, where they are pushing on the western bank of Nizhny Klin and the eastern flank of Tulsi Lug, where they've managed to gain a foothold there as well. On top of this, we actually see this footage here, where we see that the Russians have gained a foothold within the western parts of Lyubomovka and have captured the western parts. This means that the Russians are succeeding with their counteroffensive, pushing through the Ukrainian fortified positions and defenses within this village chain that they have control of with the advances they made throughout the Kursk incursion, and the Russians are at the same time flanking it from the southern direction of Darino. This means that the Russians are now continuously pushing the Ukrainians back across the front line in the eastern parts. At the same time, we see geolocated footage of the Ukrainians attacking the Russians in the direction of Vysily, here to the southwest of Glushkovo, and we see in this that the Ukrainians are making another gamble within a gamble. The Kursk offensive itself was a massive gamble, putting a lot of their reserves into an offensive operations for a very unclear objective. Now the Russians are counterattacking, and the Ukrainians are putting another gamble with this new attack by trying to cancel this Russian counterattack by launching their own offensive. So we see that the situation is very dynamic as the Ukrainians are launching their own offensive to counter the Russian counteroffensive here in the Kursk direction. What the current situation means is that the Russians are putting their efforts into recapturing the entirety of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion, while the Ukrainians are trying to disrupt this counteroffensive by launching another offensive here in the area south of the river Seym. Which brings us back to the earlier point, which is that the Ukrainian lines is generally in a state of collapse near multiple sections of the front line. Every point where the Russians are currently advancing near Vuhledar, the Russians threaten a collapse of the Ukrainian front near Vuhledar by disrupting all of its supply lines, and with the capture of coal mine number 3, the Ukrainian positions here are extremely difficult. Near the Ukrainsk section of the front line, the Russians are operationally encircling the town, or what remains of it, and with this they'll be able to push towards Hirnik, and with the capture of Hostre yesterday, this section of the front line is also very difficult for the Ukrainians. In the Chasiv Yar section of the front line, the Russians have crossed over the canal on multiple areas, and they have a very strong position on the western bank of the canal with multiple crossings, and the Ukrainian positions here are being spread thin. With the loss of Ryurivka and the fortified positions south of it, the situation here is very difficult as well and near collapse. If we'll take a look in the Kursk direction, the Russian counteroffensive is very strong and very successful so far, with constant advances, and this also leads to the Ukrainian positions in the Kursk incursion to be near collapse. Therefore, we see that the Ukrainian lines of, which means that the situation for the Ukrainians right now is very difficult across the entirety of the front line, and multiple areas are near collapse. The current situation is unsustainable for Ukraine, and they need to do something drastic to salvage the situation. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Click on the video for a brief explanation on the situation of the front line and my mapping. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.